Hi, I'm Matthew Lapp, host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy Segment Show. Also today in this segment, I'm at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Railway Museum is open Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 9 to 5, and train rides are usually on the first and third Saturday from April to September. Also, admission to the museum is free. The train rides start at 9:15 and departs the museum grounds every 2 hours during the regular operating schedule, and the events the train operates are listed if you check online about that. The train ride goes down the historic Missouri-Kansas-Texas line. The museum was founded in 1972 as the Oklahoma chapter of the National Railway Historical Society by those wanting to preserve history and share their passion for trains with their fellow Oklahomans. The museum started collecting equipment and artifacts and making connections with railroads. It's not easy to store trains, though, and the organization realized they needed to find a permanent location to house their historical hobby. The chapter began hosting passenger train rides across Oklahoma's historic tracks to raise seed money for a museum site in the early 90s. They were able to partner with the Central Oklahoma Parking and Transportation Authority in 1997 for the use of tracks that ran from Northeast 16th to Northeast 36th Street. COPTA required the organization to keep the right-of-way maintained and mowed in exchange for being able to use the tracks. Volunteers spent almost 900 hours that first year cleaning and clearing the right-of-way and restoring the overgrown tracks. In 1999, the chapter purchased a piece of land along the tracks and renovations started. Fences, parking lots, and restrooms were built, and the plans were drawn up for the making of a museum. The chapter officially changed their name to the Oklahoma Railway Museum, and the museum opened in 2002. The next year, the Oklahoma Railway Museum renewed their lease with COPTA for the tracks and expanded the live rail all the way to Northeast 50th Street, giving them 3 miles of operational track. In 2017, there was a plan to renovate the museum grounds and expand the project as well. What you see right behind me is Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 2571. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 2571 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1949 and is the 7746th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a CF7 type diesel locomotive. Originally, it was built as an F7A type diesel locomotive, and originally it was numbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 202L, and mainly used to pull passenger trains as well. In 1973, it was retired and was rebuilt by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Cleburne shops in Cleburne, Texas, and converted to being a CF7 and renumbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 2571. Later, it was sold to Los Angeles Junction and retained its number. In 2012, it was donated to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma by the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, and then it was being repainted to its Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe letters. Today, it is preserved here at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and also it is even used to pull the museum's passenger train sometimes as well. What you see right behind me is Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 1492. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 1492 was built by the Budd Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1942 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named OCU Star Express. In the 1940s, the car was part of the Super Chief train set, and then in the 1950s on the Chief. Then in the 1960s on the Texas Chief, and it was used on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad on passenger trains many years ago, and also would be used for carrying passengers on board as well. Then it was used by Amtrak and renumbered as Amtrak 8037. Then Howard Thornton of Midwest Travel acquired the car and named it Soonerland II. It was used for several excursions around Watonga, Oklahoma in the 1990s. Then in 2011, museum member Harry Curry donated the car to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is preserved today. Also, it can be seen rolling on the museum's tracks with the passenger train as well. What you see right behind me is Oklahoma Railway Museum 115. Oklahoma Railway Museum 115 was built by the Budd Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1938 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named Kerr McGee Explorer. Originally, this car was built as a 51-seat chair observation car and was originally numbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3199. Also, it was used on the El Capitan train set and used on the inaugural run of the train. The car was used on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad on the back end of the El Capitan passenger trains many years ago and also would be used for carrying passengers on board as well. Then in 1960, the car was converted into a standard 44-seat coach by squaring the observation end by the railroad, and it was renumbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 2947. Then in 1969, it was sold to the Penn Central Railroad and was renumbered as Penn Central 2407. As well as that, it was converted into a 108-seat commuter coach. Then, in the 1980s, the car was bought by the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City Railroad, and it was renumbered as Cedar Rapids and Iowa City 115 and used for their excursion train. In 1994, the car was rebuilt by the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad into a 72-seat coach. Then, in 2005, it was purchased by the Oklahoma Centennial Commission and donated it to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is seen today. Also, it can be seen rolling on the museum's tracks with the passenger train as well. What you see right behind me is Missouri, Kansas, Texas 48. Missouri, Kansas, Texas 48 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1951 and is the 150/29th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an SWA type diesel locomotive. This engine, however, wasn't actually used by the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad, but originally was used by the United States Army and originally numbered as the United States Army 2034, and even used for shunting cars around as well. Then in 1987 it was rebuilt at Hill Air Force Base and then was delivered to the Army Ammunition Plant in McAlester, Oklahoma. In 1992, it was transferred to Fort Sill, Oklahoma from McAlester. While it was in Fort Sill, it was sent to Tulsa, Oklahoma for being painted red. Later, the locomotive was retired and came to be part of the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is today. In 2015, it was repainted in a Missouri, Kansas, Texas paint scheme and numbered 48 as well. Today, it is preserved at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and sometimes it is seen operating on the museum's tracks as well. Okay, I'm gonna get behind the camera and show you guys this beautiful mural on all these plywood boards that they have attached to the fence. So I'll get behind the camera and here we go. Alright, here we start right here. Right here is a New York Central Streamline train. Looks nice how they put this together. And look at that mural. Wonder what that railroad could have been. And this railroad looks like New York Central maybe, or wait, it could be Soo Line, I don't know, but leave a comment down below what you guys think in this one and this one. And here's a Soo Line one, that's the 735, I think it's in Gladstone, Michigan, or maybe it's in Appleton, Wisconsin. And that looks like the Streamline Diesel in Duluth or Ladysmith. Here's an engineer driving a steam locomotive. There's a caboose from the Santa Fe Railroad in likely the New Mexico desert or Arizona desert. And this is the East Broad Top right here. And I am not sure what this could be. Hard to tell. Leave a comment below if you know. This looks like a Frisco steam locomotive. Yeah, I believe so. Here's a Santa Fe bobber caboose, as well as an articulated engine at a yard. Here's one of the painting of one of the diesels here at the museum. I think all these were done by Palmer. And look at that old photo of old time, or I should say painting of old time. And I think this might have been Santa Fe maybe. Here's the tender engine that's here at the museum. It was bought by the museum later on. Yeah, that was, and before it came here, it was donated to the fairgrounds, and the fairgrounds had no need to keep for it. You might know about this in a different video. Here's a Frisco logo, Oklahoma Centennial, and the museum logo. And look at this. Rock Island, Burlington Northern, TSU. Wonder what TSU stands for. Missouri Pacific Lines, and the Santa Fe logo. And yeah, doesn't this fence mural look nice or what? I think so too. I would think so too, my friends. So let's just walk back and then the video will end there. I might be right about this Sioux Line engine. It might be in Appleton, Wisconsin. And here's where we started. Okay, you could see right here is a diesel motor from an Alco, which it says right here, Alco 12-cylinder locomotive engine built by the American Locomotive Works, Alco for short. And yeah, who knows where this could have been on. Who knows where this one could have been. And those wheels may have also been a freight car wheel. Those trucks may have came from a freight car once before. And here they are by the entryway of the Oklahoma Railway Museum today. What you see right behind me is Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 90. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 90 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1967 and is the 331/89th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an FP45 type diesel locomotive. It was originally numbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 100, then renumbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 90, then renumbered to 5990, then it was renumbered 5940, and then finally 90 once again, and was in 11 different paint schemes. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 90 was used as one of 8 new generation passenger diesels built and also hauled Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe passenger cars. The locomotive also pulled freight trains many years ago. Then, in 1999, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 90 was retired and then donated to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma by the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, where it is today. Also, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 90 is one of 6 surviving FP45s left in the world today and can be found here at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is today. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 17834. Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 17834 was built by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific shops in Chicago, Illinois in 1940 and is an outbraced wooden caboose. Originally, it was built as an outbraced wooden boxcar, which was built by the Bettendorf Company of Bettendorf, Iowa. Then later it was rebuilt as a wooden caboose. Also, it was used as the train crew's office for many years and also was used on the back of freight trains for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad as well. Then it was retired in the 1970s and was purchased by John Kirkpatrick and parked it next to his lumber yard in Oklahoma City, where he used the caboose for meetings and parties. Then, in 1978, his family donated the caboose to the Central Oklahoma Rail Fan Club, the predecessor organization to the Oklahoma Railway Museum. It was moved in 1978 to 1979 and put on display behind the Kirkpatrick Center, which later became part of the Omniplex, now the Science Museum of Oklahoma. Then the caboose came to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and starting in 2010 and for 7 years, the car was being cosmetically restored to how it once looked many years ago, till everything on it was well completed. Also, today you can find it here preserved at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and preserved on display, and you can check out the interior of the car as well. What you see right behind me is Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 999-624. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 999-624 was built by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe shops in Wichita, Kansas in 1949 and is a CE3 class all-steel caboose. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 999-624 was originally numbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 2299 and was used on the end of freight trains many years ago on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad as the train crew's office. Then, in 1969, the caboose was rebuilt and renumbered as 999-624 and then continued service on the railroad. Then later on, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 999-624 was retired and in 1982 was then sold to Ken Mitchell in 1983, where he had it sit on display at a location just south of Guthrie, Oklahoma for many years. Then in 2018, his son Mark donated the caboose to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and moved to the museum grounds in 2019. Today, it is preserved at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is today. You see right behind me is Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 643. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 643 was built by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Cleburne shops in Cleburne, Texas in 1897 and is the 774th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 643 was originally numbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 993, and this locomotive worked its life for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad for many years, like I believe it was a freight locomotive. Then in 1900, the locomotive was renumbered as 643, which it is presently, and continued its career for the railroad. Then, in 1953, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 643 was retired and donated to the city of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and also displayed at the Oklahoma State Fairgrounds for many years, and sat under a shelter on the grounds. Then, in 2015, the locomotive was relocated to being part of the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and was cosmetically restored till about 2017 when the project was completed. Also, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 643 is one of 13 surviving Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 280s left in the world today and can be found here at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is today. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 615. Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 615 was built by Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois in 1954 and is the 187/59th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an S1 1200 type diesel locomotive. Originally, it was numbered as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 1638 and was even used to shunt and even haul freight cars on the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad as well. Then in 1959 renumbered as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 615. In 1938 the engine was sold to Chrome Crankshaft. It was then resold to the United States Navy and numbered as United States Navy 65-00627. Then it was transferred to the United States Army and was renumbered as United States Army 4649 and was even used for shunting cars around as well. Then in 2017 it was bought by the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and also it was still how it was when it worked for the United States Army and still pulled the museum's passenger train. Then it was repainted in 2020 to its original paint scheme and numbered as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 615 as well, and sometimes it can also be seen pulling the trains on the museum's tracks and even moving equipment as well. What you see right behind me is Oklahoma Railway Museum 301. Oklahoma Railway Museum 301 was built by General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1941 and is the 130/59th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a 45-ton center cab type diesel locomotive. Originally, this locomotive was used by the United States Army and originally numbered as United States Army 1202 and was used for the United States Army and would serve on the Army Railroad many years ago and would even be used for moving rail cars around as well. It was used by the Army in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Then it was later used by the Dodge City, Fort and Buckland Railroad. Then the Vulcan Chemicals of Wichita, Kansas. Then the locomotive was retired and in 2000 it was donated to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and sometimes it is seen moving equipment around and even pulling the train as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 743. Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 743 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1943 and is the 708 17th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an RS1 type diesel locomotive. It was used for many years by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad and used mainly to haul freight trains a lot as well. Then, in 1968, it was sold to Hyman Michaels Company, and it was renumbered 243 that time, and then was sold to Birmingham Rail and Locomotive, Chattahoochee Valley. Then, in 1973, it was sold to Birmingham Southern. Then, in 1974, it was sold to South Hopkins Coal Company. In 1981, it was sold to the Sydney Low Railroad. In 1986, it was sold to Eddie Birch Jr. and Jim Terrell. Then it was retired and in 2000 was donated to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and was repainted to how it originally looked when it came out of the factory. Today, Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 743 can be seen on display at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is preserved where it is today. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 6015. Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 6015 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1921 and is a combine car. This car was used on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad and was used for passenger service and carried baggage, and one end is where the baggage compartment is, and also was used on passenger trains when being used on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. In 1940, it was streamlined into a baggage dorm for use on the Arizona Limited and the Golden State Limited. This car was converted to a maintenance of way dormitory car for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad and renumbered as Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 6015. Then it sat on the Capital Steel Company's tracks awaiting to be cut up for scrap that it was stored on but didn't meet the torch. In 2001, it was donated to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is preserved today, and also it is used for birthday parties as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 4119. Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 4119 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1927 and is a baggage car. This car was used on board passenger trains for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad many years ago and carried baggage on board many years ago. Then, in 1957, it was converted to being a tool car and renumbered as Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 96155 and used in maintenance of way service as well. Then the car was retired and was bought by the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and was numbered back to its original number. Also, inside the car, you can see it has the model railroad inside as well as model trains on display inside as well. Okay, I'm going to show you all the model railroad they have on display in this car right here. I'll get behind the camera and show you guys around, so here we go. Okay, so here we go inside the model train display. Here's a display case right here. This is HO scale. Look at all those. That's N gauge right there. There's a train that runs on the wall. That looks like one of the diesels in the collection when it was like that before being bought by the museum or donated. Wow, isn't this well detailed or what? Oh, and look at all these on the wall. These old pictures and this old clock. And yeah, this is also well detailed. I'm not gonna lie. Excuse me. And yeah, well, there's another CF7. Wow, they sure have a good job on this model railroad display car. What you see right behind me is the Kansas City, Mexico and Orient Oakwood Depot. The Kansas City, Mexico and Orient Oakwood Depot was built in 1905 and was originally located in Oakwood, Oklahoma. Also, this depot was used for the Kansas City, Mexico and Orient Railroad in Oakwood, Oklahoma, and it was even used for passengers to buy a ticket and also board a train to go somewhere, or people to arrive in Oakwood on a train from somewhere and even sit in the waiting room while waiting for the train as well. Then later on, the depot was retired, and then in 2000 was bought by the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and moved to the grounds, and also today it is used as the museum's ticket office and gift shop as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 14107. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 14107 was built by Wells and French in Chicago, Illinois in 1878 and is a one-way car caboose. This caboose was used on the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, which was a subsidiary of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and when it was used on the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, and it was originally numbered as Burlington and Missouri River 10. Then it was used on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad when the railroad acquired the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad and renumbered as Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 14107 and used behind freight trains on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad during the career of this caboose and was used as the railroad workers' office when being used behind freight trains on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad as it did on the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad as well. Then when the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy merged to the Burlington Northern, it was then used by the Burlington Northern Railroad and renumbered as Burlington Northern 11021. Then in 1973 it was retired and was sold to George Shirk, who was a former mayor of Oklahoma City. In 1981, George then donated it to the Central Oklahoma Rail Fan Club, which is a predecessor organization to the Oklahoma Railway Museum. In 2005, the car was completely restored, and today it is preserved here at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where it is seen today. Okay, you can see right here's a crane flatbed on display, and it's been in the collection for a number of years, but here it is today on display at the museum in Oklahoma City. You could see right here's a Speeder 6610, it looks like it's numbered. Was once probably used by Southern Pacific many years ago, but here it is on display today. What you see right behind me is Union Pacific 58259. Union Pacific 58259 was built in 1953 and is a flat car. Originally, the car was used by the Southern Pacific Railroad and used on the Southern Pacific Railroad many years ago and used for carrying stuff that a flat car carried many years ago, such as steel beams, bulldozers, and other kinds of construction machines and other different types of cargo that are carried on railroad flat cars that it once carried in the past. It was built as a Class F70-12 and was the 12th design of 70-ton flat cars built for use by the Southern Pacific. This car was rebuilt in 1965. When the Union Pacific bought the Southern Pacific in 1995, the car was renumbered as Union Pacific 58259 for the Union Pacific Railroad. It was used as a piggyback trailer unloading ramp in the Union Pacific's former Rock Island yard in downtown Oklahoma City. It was then donated to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and in 2003 it was rebuilt as an open-air car for passengers riding on it as well. Also, it can be seen rolling on the museum's tracks with the passenger train as well. Today, it is preserved at the Oklahoma Railway Museum, where it is today. What you see right behind me is Great Northern X21. Great Northern X21 was built by the Great Northern Railroad in 1958 and is a streamlined style cupola caboose. This caboose was used by the Great Northern Railroad as Great Northern X21 and used behind freight trains on the Great Northern Railroad as the train crew's office. Then later, when the Great Northern merged to form the Burlington Northern Railroad in 1970, it was renumbered as Burlington Northern 10381 and used behind freight trains on the Burlington Northern Railroad. Then, in 1985, this caboose was retired and was donated to the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma by the Burlington Northern Railroad, where it is seen today. Also, it can be seen rolling on the museum's tracks with the passenger train as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago Northwestern 7721. Chicago and Northwestern 7721 was built by Pullman Standard in 1929 and is a combine car. This car was used on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad and was used for passenger service and carried baggage, and one end is where the baggage compartment is, and also was used on passenger trains when being used on the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. The car was taken out of service sometime after 1939 and eventually sold to the Dodge City, Ford and Buckland Railroad. It was repainted in a blue and white color scheme and renumbered as Dodge City, Ford and Buckland 136. The car and several others were later purchased by the Guthrie Arts Council and moved to Guthrie, Oklahoma. In 2004, the car was bought by the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and was repainted in its Chicago and Northwestern paint scheme, returning the car to its original number as well. Today, it is preserved at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and also is wheelchair accessible. Sometimes the car is seen operating on the museum's tracks as well. What you see right behind me is Oklahoma Railway Museum 113. Oklahoma Railway Museum 113 was built by the Budd Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1938 and is a passenger car. Also, the car is named Oklahoman. This car was originally numbered as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3105. It was built as a 52-seat coach. Also was part of the first El Capitan train set as well, and it was used on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad on passenger trains many years ago, and also would be used for carrying passengers on board as well. In 1969, it was then converted to being a 108-seat coach and was also sold to the Penn Central Railroad and renumbered as Penn Central 2413 and used on commuter trains as well. In the 1980s, the car was bought by the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City Railroad and it was renumbered as Cedar Rapids and Iowa City 113 and used for their excursion train. In 2001, the car was rebuilt by the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad into a 72-seat coach. In 2005, it was bought by the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and given the name by the museum. Also, it can be seen rolling on the museum's tracks with the passenger train as well. What you see right behind me is Missouri, Kansas, Texas 1045. Missouri, Kansas, Texas 1045 was built by the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad Shops in Denison, Texas in 1975 and is an inspection car. Originally, this car started out as a 40-foot all-steel Pullman standard boxcar. Later, it was rebuilt as an inspection car for the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad and was painted green and used as the railroad's operating department for track inspections between 1973 and 1988. After the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad was acquired by Union Pacific in 1988, this car was no longer needed and was set to be given to the city of Denison, Texas for display, but however, due to delays, it was instead sold to the United States Army, who painted it red and was used at the Fort Sill Army Base in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where the car was used as an office to do load plans to ship out military trains and trucks. Then later it was acquired by the Oklahoma Railway Museum and it stayed in Fort Sill till 2012 and moved to the museum. From 2016 till 2017, it was repainted to its original paint scheme when it was rebuilt as an inspection car, and the project was soon completed. Today, it is preserved at the Oklahoma Railway Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and sometimes it is seen rolling on the museum's tracks as well. Well, I hope you all enjoyed learning about trains with me today in Matthew Lapp Train Guy segment show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment. And if you didn't subscribe to my channel just yet, please be sure to do so. The subscribe button is just down below. And if you didn't give my Facebook page a like yet, here's where you can find it. And if you didn't follow the Instagram page yet, here's where you can find it as well. And also, remember to subscribe to the Train Guy. So this is Matthew Lapp, host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy segment show, signing out. Until next time, all aboard!